As Margaret Davis moved through the forest on the rough, narrow trail cut between towering trees and around massive boulders, her mind went to the circumstances which brought her to this place in her life. Why now, at the age of 63, an age where most women were sitting by the fire and tending their grandchildren, was she risking her life in the search for a single piece of paper? Perhaps it wasn't the paper which was so important, but what it signified. A confirmation that everything she had suffered, all that she had given up, and the sorrow brought down upon her family throughout the years would not have been in vain. Her life seemed to have been one long walk over rough ground, interspersed with boat rides into the unknown. Married at 18, she and Ethel Davis had moved the family all to Brier Island, Nova Scotia, to make a new life. Finally, they had seemed to arrive at a place that was to become home. They had farmed their land, producing food for their 8 children. Sheep had provided wool for their clothing, and oxen and cows provided other necessities. For 13 years, life was as good as she felt it should be, but the pain of that February day in 1801 was still sharp in her heart. Slipping from a ship's mast as it was being launched, her beloved husband was badly injured. Despite knowing the healing powers of so many herbs and having them at her ready in the garden, she had not been able to save her husband. 3 months she had labored, using every bit of knowledge and cunning she had been taught and absorbed through the years. It was for naught. Ethel would never see the child who was growing in his wife's womb or work beside her in the fields ever again. At age 38, it was up to her to see that her children were fed, clothed, and schooled. It was her responsibility to make sure the crops were planted and harvested. The children could help, but it was she who had to keep them together. They had seen bad times, Margaret remembered. In 1816, summer didn't come. A horrible volcanic eruption made its impact on their little world. Crops were frozen and sheep died of the cold. It was necessary for Margaret to mortgage her land many times. As she walked, she thought again about her land. It was the one thing that she owned that had supported her. It provided food, could be mortgaged to provide money. It was where her house was built to protect her family from the elements. To Margaret, it was almost a living, breathing member of her family, and she was not going to let it go. Her family had supported her, even rowing her through the strong tide and wind-whipped waves from Brier Island to Clementsport. Maybe they thought it was a fool's errand, but they did give her that much support. She was not ready to live with one of her children. She was strong, independent, and healthy. She knew that. Why else would she even consider this long trek through the woods, exposing herself to wild animals, the weather, and people who couldn't speak her native language of German? A friendly family. The Ditmaster provided her a letter written in English, which she could show to people along the way, explaining where she was going and why. It helped her find some places to lay her head and rest on her journey, but there were many nights she lay on the ground staring into the sky above. Sleep did not come easily. Margaret's sister Christina was waiting in Dutchtown for her. Margaret was finally able to clean herself and rest in a warm bed. Christina too was a widow who had property to be confirmed, as well as their mother Catherine. A lot was riding on Margaret's shoulders. If they didn't successfully confirm their lands through Lieutenant Governor Kempt, she would have nowhere to live, and her mother and sister would lose any money they could raise through sale of those lands. At times, John Hatch, the man who had sparked this journey, provided Margaret with the extra courage to keep on going. Margaret often wondered what she and her husband had ever done to this man that he would threaten to deprive her of her main possession. He didn't even live on Brier Island, but he knew things, this John Hatch. He knew that her land had not been registered in her name, and he knew that the provincial government was looking at seizing all unregistered properties. Did this man think she was an easy mark, an old widow who would not have the energy to fight for what was hers? If that was what John Hatch thought, he was sorely mistaken. Annapolis, Albany Cross, Dalhousie, New Ross, Sherwood, Pockwalk, Hammond's Plains, the city of Halifax, her journey continued to her destination. Arming themselves with all the reasons why their lands should be theirs, Margaret and her sister Christina walked together through the dusty streets of Halifax to Province House. To their astonishment, and by incredible luck, Sir James Kemp understood German. They didn't have to resort to their poor English. The sisters told their story fluently in their native tongue. 36 shillings later, the two women confirmed 761 acres on Long and Brier Islands. It was theirs to do with as they wished. A sudden clatter of hooves on the cobblestone street in front of Province House signaled an arrival. Sweeping into the room where the sisters sat with James Kemp was John Hatch. Margaret was amazed. The man was so intent on seizing her property that he rode to Halifax to make his claim for the same land. Angry at seeing the two women in Province House before him, he lashed out, decrying in coarse language his unfair treatment. A smile formed on Margaret's face as she saw him dismissed by the Lieutenant Governor. The trip back would be just as draining, but somehow Margaret was able to keep a spring in her step as she traveled the trail, knowing that she had won. The land she and her family had worked would remain hers. For another 27 years, it was her home and refuge. Eventually, she was able to pass it to her family upon her death in 1858. Perhaps, though, the land was not the most important thing that she had passed on.